Welcome to our fifth and final program in the Carolina on My Mind book discussion series. This whole program has been funded once again by South Carolina Humanities and presented in partnership with our friends here at the Beaufort County Library. Today we get to learn about Padgett Powell's 1984 debut novel, Edisto, which was nominated for the National Book Award. On the back of the original hardcover edition, and even now on the back of this paperback edition, there is this quote from iconic Southern writer Walker Percy, who praised Edisto as, quote, a truly remarkable first novel, both as a narrative and in its extraordinary use of language. It reminds one of The Catcher of the Rye, but it's better, sharper, funnier, more poignant. To which the Washington Post, in their review, responded, quote, Walker Percy is quoted on the novel's dust jacket as saying that it reminds one of The Catcher in the Rye. For once, a dust jacket is right. Our discussion leader today is somebody very familiar to Conroy Center programming, of course. Ellen Malphrus is the newly named writer-in-residence at the USC Beaufort, where she teaches literature and creative writing. She is the author of Untying the Moon, the novel that was published by Pat Conroy's Story River Books. And like Pat, Ellen, too, is a student of James Dickey, poet and novelist. And Ellen serves on our advisory council and is deputy director of the Pat Conroy Literary Festival. So please welcome Ellen.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, folks, for turning out for this event during the busy holiday shopping season. In chit-chatting with you folks before we begin here, I have learned that most of you have not read this book, at least in its entirety. And so I'm going to gear my remarks towards you as an audience of budding aficionados of Padgett Powell. Padgett Powell has Carolina ties. He grew up in Florida, around and spent some high school years in Jacksonville with some of the Leonard Skinner crowd. Somewhere along the way, his father moved to Florence, South Carolina, and he spent some time there. But he, like Pat Conroy, tells that he was, for Padgett Powell, I believe he said 17 different schools by the time he graduated from high school, but he was here, there, all over the place, as I say, mostly in Florida. He went to College of Charleston, made D's in a lot of his English classes, got a degree in chemistry, and then sort of bummed around, did this, that, and the other, everything from shrimping to bag boy to you name it. Fell into Houston somewhere along the way as an itinerant worker, and as he tells it, when he became destitute, beyond destitute, he decided that he would go back to school, and so he went to the University of Houston, enrolled in a writing program. And there he came under the tutelage of one Donald Bartlemy. That's the other guy on the back of this cover, and that's how you say it, Bartlemy. I know that from Dr. Don Greiner, my beloved teacher of postmodernism. So Bartlemy, at the time that Padgett Powell came into his world, was big stuff. Postmodernism in the 70s, early 80s was a burgeoning subgenre of literary fiction, and Don Bartlemy was rather at the center of John Hawkes, John Barth. Bartlemy was right up in there. And to come under those wings were pretty big wings. Bartlemy recognized in Padgett Powell genius, and I will agree with his assessment. He took this manuscript and helped Padgett Powell edit it, convinced Padgett Powell that the word that Powell uses is pedantic. That pedantic storytelling is not the only way of storytelling. That experimenting with the possibilities of narrative is something that is not only possible, but in his estimation anyway, something that writers should strive for. We all know that there are so many same old stories, and we tell them and retell them. We tell them hopefully in our own way. The postmodern, that group of postmodern writers further had the feeling that not just telling the same story, but the parameters around which, into which, through which you get that story across is something that should really matter. Wacky stuff is what Bartleby called it, the kind of what I think most of us would call experimental type narratives, as opposed to the well-made novel, as opposed to Once Upon a Time and then the end at its most basic. But so wacky stuff. But Padgett Powell tells the story that in class, Bartleby encouraged these students to mess around with narrative structure, with the wacky stuff, cautioned them that the wackier you get, the more experimental you get, the more you've got to make sure that you, break their hearts. And this is something that I really appreciate in Bartleby and in his teaching of this, encouraging Padgett Powell in this way, because quite frankly, even though I am a student of and a professor of postmodern literature, teaching a course in postmodernism, much of it leaves me cold. Much of it I can appreciate, and I teach my students to appreciate because of its intellectual pleasures. But intellectual pleasures don't get you but so far in my book. You know, I come from the school of James Dickey, where if it doesn't get you in the gut first thing, then it's not worth messing with, right? My own is I want to be gotten in the gut, and I want to be gotten in the heart, and I want to be gotten in the head. I want it all. And I think that Bartleby's attitude on that and its influence on Padgett Powell made a real difference. So there's that. There's the Bartleby influence. Back at College of Charleston, Nan Morrison. You guys know Nan Morrison? Nan Morrison, Padgett Powell credits with his becoming a writer. And he tells the story that Nan Morrison came into class on a Monday, big pregnant, about to have a baby. Wednesday, she was absent from class. Friday, she showed up with an infant on the hip, and as best he recalls, she taught the Miller's Tale. Chaucer's The Miller's Tale. And so he, and his telling of the story is that he, there listening to her in class with this babe in arms, began to daydream about this baby who is, 2 years old, and hearing the Miller's Tale and how that would affect this child, how being the child of a mother who is like Nan Morrison, and he says that is the moment that Edisto was born. His thinking about how that child would grow up with the influences. And so if you have gotten that far into the novel, you know that our protagonist, Simmons, spelled with one M, he's, as he tells us, a special 1M Simmons. And so that, I'm going to, as an aside, I'm going to say that from the get-go, from early in this book, when our protagonist tells us that he's a 1M Simmons, what he and our writer is saying to us is watch out, don't assume. S-I-M-O-N-S, you will assume, is going to be pronounced Simons. If the name is Simmons, you are going to assume it has 2 M's. Don't assume, right? And so we enter this narrative with that precaution. Don't assume. And so our young 12-year-old protagonist, who we would describe with words such as what? Those of you who have read into this book at all, tell me a word or two that you might use to describe. Curious. Precocious. Smartass. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. This is the child whose mother, a professor, he calls her the doctor, his mother in infancy surrounded the bassinet with stacks of books. She has had the insistence since and before his birth that he is going to be a writer. And he is going to be a reader. He is going to be surrounded, inundated with literature. The dad's a lawyer, the progenitor. Our very self-aware young protagonist at the outset of this book is distant, narratively, emotionally, or so he would have us believe, from his parents. He calls his mother the doctor, the duchess. That's what the folks in the hood around where they are living calls her, the duchess. His father, as I say, he calls the progenitor. He is a lawyer. The old man is what else he calls his dad. And there is a point in the narrative as this story progresses when we begin to see him call his father daddy as those walls come down. When this book opens, his parents are split up. Dad's back in town. He and Mom are at the beach. Now, let me warn you about geography in this book. It is entitled Edisto, yes. This book is not necessarily set in the Edisto island that you and I know, the Edisto beach that we know. He says that it is somewhere between Charleston and Savannah, like Edisto is. But the descriptions, and I've asked Padgett about this specifically, the descriptions are of some place in the early 80s more like what Kiowa or Seabrook were, an area as yet at the verge of being developed. In fact, where this beach house is, this wonderful pagoda-shaped beach house, which was the model home for a development that went belly up, that hasn't yet to be. The roads were cut in, so that is behind the scenes all the way through here. That what has happened at Hilton Head, which he speaks at length on. Our narrator here, our protagonist for a 12-year-old, speaks very eloquently and with great vehemence about the horrors of development and overdevelopment. But so Edisto and the place that they are is a place on the coast that still has the culture of the African American folks, the juke joints. In fact, the baby Grand, the Grand, is where our young protagonist spends a lot of time. We get to know the proprietor there and some of the patrons there, and he hangs out there. He sips on cold beers. He thinks that he's got everybody fooled, and one of the things that they love about him is that he's able to hold his liquor, so to speak. And that they don't know that he drinks a few sips and then slides it to one of the patrons. Now, of course, you and I would have to suspect that everybody in there knows exactly what's going on. But they humor him and evidently love him, and he certainly loves them, and he spends time there. But so Edisto, the book opens in the very first line. He mentions my home, Bluffton, all right? I'm in Bluffton on a truancy spree. So, living somewhere at Edisto, school is in Bluffton. They go into church in Savannah. So Powell's using all the place names, but he's not using them, never claims that he's using them, with any kind of geographical accuracy. that it's set in the low country of South Carolina, that the marshes and the ocean and all those geographical features of landscape are certainly accurate, but don't get hung up when you're reading it. And don't start thinking, now hang on, if they're going to do that and she's going in to teach at Charleston, is what our presumption is, how are they going to live? How are they going to be on Hilton Head? Does that mean she's going to, don't get hung up on that. The language of Padgett Powell's work is what knocks my socks off. When I reread this book yesterday to talk about him, I closed the book and whipped off a little email to Padgett Powell saying, I'll tell you what it says, because of course, jot it down. Just quick, but Dear Padgett, having just read Edisto to give this talk today, I must tell you that in this season of purported miracles, the fact that a cantankerous old cynic like you has trusted the intelligence of his readers since the get-go is a marvel to me. Thanks for the way you give us words. And it's true. He trusts that we are going to be careful, intelligent readers. And when we slow down enough and when we pay attention to the language, to what he's saying and how he's saying it, we are so richly rewarded. And that is taking a risk. As a writer, that's taking a risk. We read a lot that's easy to read. And I'm not at all meaning to suggest that a book ought to be difficult to read. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that when a writer doesn't feel the need to wallop the reader over the head with a piece of the plot, for example, and then a few pages later remind us again if we forgot to make sure we've got it, I just really admire that he trusts that his reader is going to pay attention. I'm going to pull back just a minute and read you a passage. And if you want to read along, you may. It is a passage from kind of later. This book is a Bildungsroman. You guys know that nice fancy word? Well, teacher without a chalkboard. Bildungs, Bildungsroman, book, Roman, German word, Bildungsroman. Anybody want to hazard the guess? Yes, a coming-of-age story. A coming-of-age story. A story of awakening in any number of ways, from physical to spiritual. So many of the books we know and love are Bildungsromans, from Catcher in the Rye to on and on and on. To Kill a Mockingbird, the book I just taught. So many of our well-loved books are coming-of-age stories. And this is what we have. It wouldn't surprise you, since we've got a 12-year-old narrator whose parents are split up and who's going through learning about life, learning about girls, and what's more, learning about these things in part by hanging out up at the joke joint. Okay, so it makes for a very interesting coming of age. He also has, as an influence, a friend of his mother's. His mother, since the parents have been divorced or have been split up, have each had various friends of the male and female persuasion. This particular guy is someone who serves warrants, who came around to serve a warrant not on our people, but on the daughter of Feeny, who is the maid. Feeny sees this guy coming and she hauls butt. Feeny, during the course of this book, is MIA because she's not interested in getting hung up with the government, as she perceives everybody who has any kind of overlap with the law, as it were. So this guy, whom Simmons names Taurus, his mother has given Theeny's house to live in while Theeny's not there, Theeny's little shack down the beach. And Taurus helps to school our man Simmons. He takes him into Charleston to see the Joe Frazier Muhammad Ali fight, and he takes him on his first date, and he when he's sipping his whiskey there at the shack, he makes in the mason jar for Simmons a little aroma of whiskey for Simmons to be sipping on. So I'm going to take you, it's kind of later in the book, but I had marked this passage yesterday just because it tickled me. And it's on page 148. This is on the business of girls and figuring all that out. I think it was like that at the Grand. Now, the Grand is the honky-tonk. There are some dudes there who come out of the woods and woodwork with razor scars on their faces, across foreheads, through ears cloven into baby fists, from the corners of eyes like scalding tear tracks. Even Jake has a little one. It dents his nostril. And my information, which I got from watching the bug tussles they get in before Jake halts them with the shortest shotgun in the world, is that 2 out of 100 of those scars had anything to do with gambling, and the remaining 98 faces, cut deep to bone, blood flying like hog stuck, are about pussy. And even the 2 gambling fights are about not the money lost, but the pride lost in losing, and that's close to the 98 reasons for the other. So pussy is the big nightclub reaper. It beats liquor, dancing, music, hemp, pills, rapping, racing cars, money, friends, and good times. And that's why, even at my youthful point of promise, my hair not even cropped in yet, I vibrate on the edge of the deep end over some bottle of liquor in a sack in a cabinet. What the hell can that stuff be, for God's sakes? More than your finger inside your cheek, you rest assured. That's what one of the boys had described, said I to Mass. But what? I even think now, given this new disturbance I have had, that I am not going to know what it is, even if old Alta Denine, that was his first date, dropped trow and said, "Get some of this cooter, stud, and if you can't kiss me, you can pull my hair." And I say, "Did," jumped on it like a woodpecker alighting on a sapling, and did what you do. If this happened tomorrow, I would have no better idea why finding Taurus in Penelope's bower, Penelope is another term he uses for his mom, Penelope and Ulysses, was such a big deal, and why you will cut somebody's nose off when under different circumstances it's enough to punch it in. Well, I'm in these ugly meditations when the doctor gets up and announces we're going to church. We do that about thrice a year, once if it rains on Easter. I'm 3 a.m. fugued out anyway, so I sport off and we head out. It's the usual. We go to Savannah, the closest place you can find to an Episcopal layout. Right down in the slums, people already holding tall boys and blinking at the rising glare. We hit this pocket of new cars in a cathedral. All the dirt and smoke butts and dead banana trees change to the soft, stained panes of biblical wonderment. And fresh acolytes with red and white robes and white faces and red lips carry gold candles. And the priest puts on 20 sashes and linen underthings and gold braid overthings until he sweeps when he walks. And gold emerald-studded pikes get carried around with 3 prongs for the Trinity, and people kneel and stand and sing and kneel and pray on red velvet cushions that swing down for your knees like footrest under Greyhound bus seats, but of the finest, heaviest wood-pegged oak, not bent pot metal. And the sermon intones with catchphrases like "more and more," and the creeds, apostles, and somebody's get done, and we pray, then line up for communion. The father wipes the silver chalice with beautiful linen rag as large as a small tablecloth, turns the cup 2 inches each time to keep from having to drink where the last worshiper lipped it, as if that takes care of the germs. But I don't care. I always reach out very piously, that's to say in slow motion, the way you move for some reason to take and eat the body of our Savior. Reach out and lay my hand over the Father's in somber reverence to the moment, and then press down as the silver rim clears my upper lip and suck a slug of wine that should have fed 6 communers. I have to, because the bread of his body is stuck to the roof of my mouth like a rubber tire patch, And if I can't wash it loose by swishing his blood around, I'm going to have to dig it off with a finger in slow motion and possibly gag. When the service is over, we go to a Howard Johnson's for the business at hand. She wants to talk. I should have known. She orders a grilled cheese and takes one bite, as usual. She never eats. It's the liquor. I get this ice cream thing that looks like Mount Pisgah. She has cup after cup of coffee, lights a cigarette. Well, I want to tell you something very important. Shoot. I don't like to be flip, but something about parents draws that out. Your father and I, she takes a long drag, have decided to get back together. She taps out the new cigarette and lights another. Okay, I say. Contain yourself. I do, by destroying one of Pisgah's promontories. I thought you might be excited by the news. The news is fine, but what's going to happen? Well, a lot. Tap out, waitress, more coffee. We will move to Hilton Head. Oh, God, have the Arabs got him? Stop being a smartass. He has a wonderful opportunity to join a good firm, and so on and so on. And so what this means for our man Simmons is that the days of being schooled at the Baby Grand have come to an end, and now he's going to be going to the Cooper Boyd boarding school, where his daddy has wanted him to go all along. Part of the background of this is that there has been this battle of wills wherein Dad wants him to go to all the right schools and do the right things and be a boy, play baseball and do all this. And Penelope, the doctor, the Duchess, has wanted him to be a writer, to be concerned with a life of the mind. And as you certainly are not surprised, these things need to be worked out. Moderation needs to be found. And so the story is no surprise. The story of a young boy whose parents are splitting up and are trying to work things out. This isn't the surprise. The surprise and the enjoyment is in the telling of the tale, in the language of the story, in the presentation of the story. And despite his precociousness, despite his distance at the outset of this book from his parents, this name, Simmons Everson, his father's name is Everson Simmons Manigault. He's Simmons Everson Manigault. There's wonderful dialect in this book. Everybody can't do dialect. Those of you who are writers know that most of us ought to just leave it alone because it's so easy to have it, to fall flat with it. Few people have the true ear for it, and then the way to write it down so that we can hear the words. He does a beautiful job with it. The Gullah in this book is beautiful. And so when the name Manigault, and he can go and go and go, but he is ever the son, ever son. He's ever son. He is a special 1M Simmons and Manigault, but he is ever the son. And so having that come back around, and having the Duchess and the progenitor, Penelope, and the old man come back into focus for him and for us, not again, but the first time, as mother and father, is a very interesting narrative arc that Padgett Powell pulls off. Is this in any kind of sentimental, sappy way? Oh, hell no. There is nothing that we would accuse of being overly sentimental in this book at all. And yet we are well aware by the time we finish it of the very deep bonds that this kid has with Feeny, with Taurus, this surrogate father type while his dad's away, with his mother, whom he, towards the end of the book, begins calling a good soldier. Now that he's backed off his attitude about her and smart-assing off about her and the parties she has with her college professor types and making fun of them when the hurt begins to fade, he's able to talk about his mother as a good soldier and lists some reasons why. And then he even takes us back into some memories, photographs of them at the beach before this sort of thing. And so he starts out with this extreme distance, and then gradually, as he is gradually beginning to open himself up, because he has shut himself down, we are opened up as well. And he learns, one of the many things that he learns is that and this is the way he puts it, and I'll take you to this towards the end of the book. And I do, if this were all spoiler, I wouldn't be telling you all this. I mean, what happens is sort of obvious. It's the how it happens. If there were a big, good punchline, I wouldn't ruin it for you. This concludes the penultimate chapter, which ends on page 175. And I was different. He's talking about the now. Now things have happened like they have. Mine held all the plans that Doctor and Daddy would negotiate, a cross-hatching of professional ambitions. I was not going to get to be a two-cylinder syntax dude at the Grand. He's already been into this whole thing about how these black folks don't waste time on a bunch of words. Say what you mean. Say it like it is, right? Two-cylinder syntax man. He's realizing that a move to Hilton Head and going to boarding school is going to preclude his ever being a long-term, full-time, two-cylinder syntax dude at the Grand. I have to admit that because my life is cloyed by practical plans and attainable hopes, I am white. Best thing to do, I figure, is get on with it. So I said, let's go in that joint for commemorative photos. This is with Taurus, his friend, my heart really beating then. I had one of these white hearts that love this way, right? My white heart loves this way. Then, next, the past, the future, how things were, how things are going to be. Then, next. Taurus had one of these. His heart loves now, next. This moment, what's coming down the road. Now, next. And the guys at the Grand, their heart loves now. Can't be worrying about what about then and what about yonder. It's about this moment. Now. And so he has been able to, and I'll finish this paragraph, you can't change that with decisions to be cool. You can't get to that now without a congenital blessing or disease, whichever applies. Right? But so these are some of the many lessons that he has taken with his schooling. We have a wonderful situation, let's call it, at the very first of this book, when he is riding home on the school bus, and somehow or another in the back of the school bus, where of course all interesting things are learned in the back of the school bus, somehow or another the school bus opens and he goes flying out the back of the school bus and rolls down the road and lands upside an oak tree. And so we have this education, this big yellow symbol of education in a traditional kind of way, and him falling out the back of it, right? And this is what leads us into the book with the kind of alternative education that this kid is gleaning from not just his life at the Grand, but with Taurus, with being out there at the beach. But he says about that, about the bus thing, is that when he's telling this story, it's with a good is dead way of seeing. The good is dead way of seeing. In other words, everything I'm telling you, and this narrative is self-aware, by the way. I'll touch on that. And then I'm going to back off of my rambling and let you ask me some questions about this text. But if you take note of chapter 1, the title of that chapter is The Assignment. Well, the assignment is given to our young protagonist from the Duchess, the doctor, his mother, to write about what's happening since Athene left, since the maid left, since Taurus came up and scared Jesus out of Athene and she ran off and has not been back. He has been assigned to tell the story. And so the novel becomes this kind of meta expression of what we have here is the story that is self-aware, just like our young protagonist is very much self-aware. And he speaks about the story and the writing of the story in the story. That is certainly a postmodern kind of thing. He talks about the assignment. He makes references to the assignment throughout. And later in the book, he even tells us that the doctor has approved of this assignment. That the doctor says it's a good book. And so he's feeling pretty good about himself as a tale teller as the story goes on. That's one of the, it's not a heavy-handed kind of postmodern technique, but it serves so beautifully with this whole distance and self-awareness of the narrative, self-awareness of the teller of the tale, our young protagonist, Simmons Everson Manigault. Ask me a question. Yes, ma'am.
Because I've never taken any formal writing class or anything, so I really have no clue. When he is writing, do you think like the name came first, Simmons, and then he said, "Oh, what a perfect name," or does he sit there and think, "What name can I give this young man?" And it's the same thing like for the bus. Is he going, "Oh, I need symbolism for education," and there's or
I do know. And with some writers, we have this knowledge either because they have shared it in interview or written about it somewhere. Padgett Powell doesn't give a lot. He gives interviews. There's some really interesting interviews out there that I would encourage you to read. But he doesn't do a lot of that stuff, and he doesn't talk about his writing process very much. And the truth is that the answer to that question is, I think, totally dependent on the writer and the character. I certainly don't think that a writer with the capabilities of Padgett Powell would think, okay, now I need to plant a symbol of
Because I hear both of y'all in different work, a lot of different writers say, the book is writing itself.
Yes.
I have no idea where it's going. So it just.
I think that's the book writing itself is something that certainly happens. I think we can ask our writers in the house. I think that character names sometimes come immediately with the character. You know what the character's name is. I know from personal experience that's not always like that at all. And in my novel Untying the Moon, the protagonist Bailey Martin, I didn't get her name right for a long time. She was this and that, and it was part of the impediment to moving forward with the writing of the manuscript that I didn't have her properly named. And when I got it, when it finally came, then I was able to open up. It's those little games that you play, but that opened up the character to me. Another character in that book, Henrietta Simmons, her name came with her and everything about her in an entirety. She was who she was from start to finish. But I think that back to your question, I think that the naming of characters happens differently for every writer and every character. Cassandra, would you, in your experience, say that that's...
Names are very important characters for me. And sometimes I get thrown off if I'm reading a book that, it's a fascinating character. Her name is Anne or Mary. In order to have a name that matches.
Suits the character. Yes. Padgett Powell, by the way, teaches at the University of Florida. He's been there since 1984. This book, finalist for the National Book Award and was given many other prizes. His critical reputation is extremely high. He's published, I think, 6 novels and 2 or 3 collections of short stories in these years that he's been at University of Florida. Increasingly, his material is more and more what I would label postmodern. Unlike his mentor, Donald Bartlemy started off really kind of out there and became more traditional as the years went on. Padgett Powell has become more and more experimental. So the readership, not everybody appreciates, but plenty do. His book, for example, the interrogative, I just blanked. I'll tell you in a minute. The interrogative. No, this was the first novel. This was published in 1984. The interrogative, that's embarrassing. But won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, which is England's oldest literary prize for that book. There was talk of that book getting the Pulitzer. When he told Nan Morrison about this, she was thrilled, saying that this prize is second only to the Nobel Prize in Literature. It's an extremely esteemed prize. And that was 6 or so years ago. That book, the entirety of that book, is a series of questions. The entire book is a series of questions. And so, if you just pick it up and haphazardly looking, some of these are single sentence questions. Some of them are 2 or 3 sentences. They appear to be highly perhaps irrelevant, certainly not cohesive kind of questions. And yet, as you might well imagine, with someone of the skills in writing that he has, by the time you finish the narrative, the story has the storyline, the character development, all of this has come into the kind of focus, and you have the story and you have the character if you open yourself to it. But this is an example of how his work has become more and more. He doesn't like the word experimental, but structured and more non-traditional kinds of narrative ways. How about another question? Yes.
Comment.
Yes.
Can I do that?
Please.
As a reader, a little bit of shameless promotion, perhaps, of the Conroy Literary Center event a few days ago, at which Cassandra interviewed Will Schwalbe, and which was an incredible keynote. One thing he said was that books put themselves in your path, or can put themselves in your path at the right time. And I thought, well, that's an intriguing thing to say, but I really didn't think too much about it. Well, I picked up this book this morning, and this is shameful for me. I thought it was nonfiction. So I started reading it, and the language blew me away.
Yes.
The reason, though, that I was so charmed by this is that Friday night at the Literary Center event, I heard for the first time Jill McCorkle and Lee Smith, and their cadence, their talking. I mean, I'm a Northerner, and I was reading this book, and I got it, and I could barely stop to even walk here, because this is just grand. So the idea that a book puts itself in your path, it happened with this book.
Yes.
For me.
That's wonderful. Yes. So you already see the gift that he has for rhythm, the cadence, the expression of language, for this part of the world. I mean, he's nailed it.
Yeah.
He has nailed it. He has. I mean, the themes are universal. The specificity of place. It's both, as all good literature is, right? The postage stamp of here that resonates those universal themes to everywhere. Now. Yes.
So you told us about his trajectory of writing.
Yes.
What did he do in this Edisto Revisited?
Edisto Revisited. Edisto Revisited. Well, I want you to read Edisto and let that sit with you for a good long while, because Simmons Manigault is one of those characters that will be part of your life forever, like Scout Finch and so many others of our beloved characters. You will not forget this kid. And then on down the road, once you have him locked in to your repertoire, read Edisto Revisited, where we spend time with Simmons Everson Manigault as a man. Now, who would ever want to spend time with a grown man when you could spend time with a precocious little 12-year-old kid who likes to hang out at the honky-tonk? It's of course a good book. I mean, Powell can't help himself writing well. I wish he'd have left it alone. I wish he'd have. I mean, I almost think about that character in that book as a different character with a whole other story, because when I reread this book, I have a real knack for this. I do this with movies I've seen, with books I've read. I can just tune out memory. So while I know, I mean, if I had to take a test on Edisto Revisited, I could ace it. I was able to set that aside and not know the things I know about Simmons in the future and live with him now. And so don't, I'm glad you said this, because I heartily advise you to read and savor Edisto for a while before, and not read it and say, God, I love that, let me read the next one. Don't. Sorry, Padgett.
Sounds like the horror movie. I still haven't read. Whatever it is, Watchmen.
Yeah, and it's
If
awesome.
it's not, I haven't read. Well, from a cadence not being the same. I mean, I started reading it, and that's why I put it in there.
I haven't read Go Set a Watchman yet either.
Okay, I got through about.
Go Set a Watchman.
Oh, Watchmen.
Something like that.
Mockingbird Next Door. That was
4 minutes. Another question? Comments? Wrap it up. Well, I thank you so much for coming out. It has been a pleasure to spend some time with you. Enjoy your holidays, enjoy Edisto, and I'll see you on the flip side.